Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
This recording takes place online with safe physical distancing. Our featured guest today is Herb Colling. Herb Colling has an abiding interest in and respect for local history. His first two books deal with the auto industry in Windsor. He cut his teeth in 1993 on pioneering the auto age about Windsor as an automotive capital of Canada, and went on to write 99 Days, the Ford Strike in Windsor, 1945 in 1995, and Turning Points, the Detroit Riot of 1967, a Canadian perspective. His most recent book is Radio Transcriptions, Historical Vignettes of Essex County, which was edited for the Essex County Historical Society. He is a retired CBC Radio Windsor broadcaster. Welcome, Herb.
Hi there.
So your first two books cover the auto history of Windsor. What drew you to that subject matter?
Well, that's kind of an interesting story. I became friends with a fellow by the name of Carl Morgan, who was an editor of the Windsor Star at the time. We met at the press club, and we had kind of a common interest. We liked antiques, glass and china, and things like that. And so he asked me one day to go over to the States to a flea market. And on the way, in the course of the conversation, he said, what do you know about or first of all, he said, have you ever written a book, or have you ever thought about writing a book? And I said, no, actually, I've thought of it, but I've never had a subject or anything. So he said, well, what do you know about the auto industry? And I said, absolutely nothing. He said, do you want to write a book about it? And I said, sure, why not? And so we started into it. I started researching it and writing it, and he was editing it, and we'd edit back and forth, and we parlayed it into quite a nice little book. And that was the start, I guess. And helping with the editing was the thing that got me rolling, and it was very intense because even while we were editing, it came down to the day we were to publish, and we'd been going back and forth on email, sending copies of edited drafts, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning, Carl said, "Herb, enough is enough. We've got to put this thing to bed. We've got to get on with it, and that's as much as we can do." And so we stopped editing it, and he shipped it off, and we published it.
Great. And Carl Morgan was such a powerhouse editor of the Windsor Star, and I could see him sort of putting that hat on again. That was awesome. So Windsor's history as an automotive powerhouse is a source of fascination and civic pride for many Windsorites and people of this region, in Detroit as well. So how have people from the region reacted to your work?
Well, it's just a thing that they thought so well of it, because there's a huge sense of pride in Windsor that they helped put Canada on wheels. And in many respects, Windsor is the city that basically developed the auto industry in Canada because of the beginnings of Morton McGregor, who was with Ford, developed Ford of Canada way back in 1904. And it all started from there and mushroomed and became quite a history of Windsor generally. But the neat thing about the first book was that it was about the auto industry per se, and looking at old companies that had gone by the board. And at one point in Windsor, there were, I think about 24 different companies that established in Windsor to develop and sell their automobiles, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. And at one time or another, they lasted for maybe, months to years, to, of course, the big three that had the most long-standing tradition in Windsor. And the neat thing about the first book, though, is that a lot of the auto buffs who have cars and go to the auto shows and things like that, they loved the book because it put the history of their automobiles together, gave them some, I guess, a look at how they all developed in the first place, and so they were well pleased with that. And a lot of fellows, they commented on how accurate the book was, which I appreciated a great deal. And that was my claim, I guess, to fame, that there was a degree of accuracy there that people appreciated.
Just as a quick follow-up, 24 companies. What are some of the more unusual ones that you recall?
Well, companies like Gottfredson Trucks, for example, and a lot of people have never even heard of them, let alone got a sense of their history. But companies that established here, thinking that they could develop into a market, and of course Gottfredson developed the truck industry, but weren't able to sort of keep going and didn't last very long, as it turned out, which was rather unfortunate. The companies that I guess we were kind of a branch plant of the United States, to the extent that there were tariff restrictions that you couldn't import a complete car to Canada, but you could import the parts for the car duty free, and the car, to import a car would be tremendously expensive. And the idea was to develop the industry in Canada. And so sure enough, Morton McGregor, who was the fellow who pioneered Ford of Canada in 1904, he established, went over to talk to a maverick in the car industry, a guy named Ford, who'd already gone belly up a couple of times, and said, well, I'll build your cars in Canada and develop the Canadian market for you. And what Ford realized was that Canada was a dominion and part of the British Commonwealth. And so not only would he gain access to Canada, which was a very small market at the time, but he would gain access to the British Empire and become a multinational company, as it were. And so he took advantage of that and basically developed his car here. And that was the impetus for establishing all sorts of supply companies and tool and die and things like that. And so it just mushroomed from there. But it was pretty risky. I mean, Ford had already gone belly up twice, and he wasn't a sort of tried and true product. But of course, within 10 years, he developed the assembly line, and that's indeed what sort of kept the auto industry humming.
So all of the books you published have dealt with some aspect of local or Canadian history. How do you decide which stories are worth telling? How do you choose them?
Oh, it's kind of almost by accident in a way, because it started with the auto industry, and then a chapter in what was Carl's and my book, Pioneering the Auto Age. A chapter in that was about the Ford strike in 1945, the 99-day strike. And Carl had said that he might be interested in doing that, but he'd gone on to other projects by the time I got around to doing it. And so he kind of bailed out on it. And so I had to find another publisher. And interestingly enough, I found NC Press, which stands for Norman Caroline, in Toronto. And when I was a student in university, I was reading a lot of their stuff that they'd published, books about political histories and things like that. And so I submitted the manuscript to them. And Caroline's husband, Norm, and that's where NC Press comes from, Norm knew a lot of the people that I was writing about, who I could not know, of course, because it was 1945 and a lot of them were gone by the time I started to write the book. And so he determined that I was so precise on the way I developed their characters and their physical appearance and what have you, not having known them, that I must be right on all the other stuff too. And so they published it, which was kind of great. And that became a textbook, actually, at 3 different universities, one of which was the University of Windsor. And so I do the rounds as a sort of guest lecturer, which was a lot of fun.
So what was the research process like for your most recent book, Turning Points, the Detroit Riot? Well,
actually, there's a few incarnations beyond that. I've had, I think, about 6 books that I've published, but the process pretty much the same. It's a lot of grunt work. If you're familiar with Ernest Hemingway and his writing, some journalist asked him what he thought about writing. And Hemingway just looked at him and said, "It's good to have written," taking it into the past tense. It's good to have done it, but doing it is really quite a slog. And when you're dealing with history, you obviously have to go back into early newspapers. And the good thing about going back into Canadian history was that the newspapers were a matter of record, which is no longer. And so they talked about everything, all sorts of gossip and sort of neat stories and things like that, and covered the waterfront. And I think that's sort of gone by the way the times have changed since then. But you'd start with anecdotes from newspapers, then you'd look at magazine articles and any local histories and things like that you could find. So you'd go through the library and you look at book after book after book. But then you get down to the real work, which is actually talking to the people or the sons and daughters or grandchildren of the people who developed the industry. And you find all sorts of marvelous things. There's one little anecdote about the head of the Ford Motor Company in the war, actually, in 1940s. He was described as always wearing white gloves in the factory. And, the union guys say, oh, yeah, he'd do the white glove test, sort of run his finger on to see if there was any dust. I'm thinking in the 40s, obviously there was dust in the auto plants. They were pretty dirty places generally. So why on earth would he wear white gloves to do white glove testing, to look for dust? And I was at loggerheads. I couldn't find it out. And I got down to the last day in the library, and I was just kind of cruising the shelves and looking for references to this guy. And finally, I found one in a book of American automotive history. And it said that he had eczema on his hands and was allergic to the grit and the grease, I guess. And it caused all sorts of problems, skin condition problems. And so that's why he wore white gloves in the plant. So it had nothing to do with dust. It had nothing to do with cleanliness. It was just because of his personal skin condition. So I added that, and that was one of the points that sold the book to the fellow Norm, who eventually published it with Norm and Carolyn, Turning Points. And they decided, when you think about it, Carolyn was 64 years old at the time, and Norm was 83. He was in failing health. And so Caroline said, I'm going to fold the business. I know I promised to publish your next book, but I'm not going to be able to do that. And so as a consequence, she gave me all of her outstanding copies of the 99 Days book, the Ford Strike book. And she gave me the final copies of that and said, well, I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to do what I wanted to and what I told you I would do. So now, interestingly enough, she at the age of 64 went back to get her PhD, as well as take care of an ailing husband. And so more power to her. But I was despondent. I didn't know what to do. I had a book that was virtually finished. And so I relegated to the bottom drawer. And I went to Amherstburg, where one of my favorite bookstores was, a little place called Tempest Books. And the young lady there basically got me hooked up with Natural Heritage when I told her and lamented the story that this thing's in the bottom drawer. And she said, basically try them out. They usually pick up publisher or books that were promised to another publisher, but wasn't going to be published. And sure enough, I tried them out, and they published the next book, which was Turning Points. And
they published a lot of local regional histories as well. So
yeah.
And I remember them talking to me at Canadian Booksellers Association trade show, and they were so thrilled to have your book. And now they've been bought up by Dunder and Press, which is another great Canadian independent publisher. So there we go. So in the process of writing any of your other books, have there been another fact or story that you encountered that really took you by surprise, that just went, wow, this is... Yeah,
I guess the whole idea of Windsor history kind of took me by surprise. I moved down to Windsor in 1979. And I was struck at the time that all of the history that was basically talked about at that time was the War of 1812. And most of the historians concentrated on that era. And I got looking into Windsor history, and the Detroit Riot's a case in point, because I had a personal involvement with it to some extent, in that we had cousins, distant cousins, living in Detroit at the time. And so my parents had called them and said, well, you know, do you want to come to Canada as a refuge? And we were living up in Midland, Ontario at the time. And it struck me that nobody talked about all this kind of stuff, and yet there was a wealth of material. And I'm pleased to say that since that time, when I started writing about it, these other areas of interest that had never been covered. And since that time, a lot of other writers have done the same and picked up and realized what a wealth of material there is beyond just the War of 1812. So it was kind of quite remarkable. Some of the other references were, there was a guy named Harrison who worked for the Windsor Star, and he was the old style reporter, hard drinking, out all night. And he would actually wrap himself in the rug of the editor's office when he'd been on a binge, but his copy was always delivered, and so they had an edict that they would never fire him. And of course, you look at the press and the way it's developed, and that, of course, would never happen now. But it's a colorful character who basically got the stories because he was out talking to the people that he needed to talk to. And many of them were in bars at the time, which was rather convenient for a hard drinking reporter.
Windsor has a very supportive and writing and listening community. How have you tapped into that community to support your writing?
I'm not really sure. I guess I've got a following now, which is kind of nice. People sort of look for my new books and are interested in what I've written. And so that's kind of intriguing to me that people actually enjoy. And it's a great thrill when somebody comes up and said, oh, I read your book the other day, and I couldn't put it down. And in fact, there was a recent case where somebody in Windsor, down by the golf course, Beach Grove, he basically had a friend deliver a book to him, I guess because of the pandemic. And he said, I'd like you to sign it when this is kind of all over. And it was kind of nice because he basically had lived here and knew some of the people that I was writing about, and loved to hear the story. And in that case, it was about one of my most recent books. It's about Ford City, the area sort of including Drouillard Road, going all the way over to Pilette. And basically the development of Ford City. And he had been a child born and raised in the area, and was quite proud of that heritage, and found that my book had, I guess, recreated that style of life that he grew up in. And it was very an ethnic neighborhood, and the kids all played sandlot baseball and ran around on their bicycles till well after dark, and then went home, and then the next day would do it all again and play. And it was very communal, and people would sit on their front porches and chat and talk back and forth with their neighbors about sort of the local, what was the gossip and what was happening in their community and things like that. So it was very close knit, and many people have a disparaging feeling about the Drouillard Road area in particular, and it's had a lot of difficulties over the years, and I talked about those and tried to put them into a perspective.
So Herb, do you have another writing project in the works?
Oh, I keep promising myself that enough is enough, and that I'm not going to pursue any more. And it seems that I find another project to do. The one I'm working on now is, well, actually, I should mention this publication. This is an edited version of material that a friend of mine gave me. They were radio transcripts from the 40s and 50s, and she saw me at a flea market and said, well, you were sitting there and looked bored, so she gave me this volume of material, and it was so interesting, and it hadn't really been published. It had been radio transcripts on CKLW, but it hadn't gone any further from there. And I thought it was a wealth of material. A lot of it I didn't know. And so I approached Essex County Historical Society, who put it out originally, and said, would you be interested in letting me do this and putting it together as a book? We can both sell it and make a little bit of money on it. And, sort of they could use the proceeds to pay for some of their projects. And of course, I'd use the proceeds to buy shoes and keep me in the style to which I've become accustomed. And they said, sure, why not? And so we published it. It's kind of self-published. But it was my latest project. And then I decided not to go on from there. And recently my uncle, who's 93 years old now, has gone into a transition home, going into a nursing home. And I've been going through all his books and papers and stuff. And he's a gay individual. And so wanted to talk about his gay life at a time when, people were afraid of coming out of the closet and sort of, divulging the fact that they were gay, and some people who had, I guess, married and were maintaining a heterosexual lifestyle for the show of it at a time when they were sort of gay. And so I've got all this material. He basically recorded a lot of it on tape. And so I'm compiling that. And I'm not sure if it'll ever be published per se. But in the meantime, I thought, well, I'll publish it, if not for general consumption, for my nieces and certainly my sisters, who basically are in the same, I guess we always knew he was gay, but he didn't come out of the closet until the 70s, and then sort of lived out his life, and just wanted to explain about his history. So it's kind of a personal project, but a project nonetheless, and it keeps me kind of off the streets and busy.
Could I just ask about the radio transcripts?
Yeah. Guys like N.F. Morrison, wonderful stories, and some of which I've never heard before, and it was really kind of a great thing to be involved with, and basically condensing them. They had reams and reams of material, and I was restricted to 200 pages. And so I think it runs about $1.99. And so there were a lot of them that weren't particularly good. And yet others were good in parts. So I'd incorporate them and put them in sort of one theme in one area, and kind of do a compilation. And so it was a lot of fun to actually work on.
So would you like to set up a reading for us?
Oh. Yeah, I could. And I'll do it from the historical vignettes. So this isn't my material, but it's my edited material. And this one was one of the stories you asked me earlier that I particularly like. This one is entitled The Colorful Colonel in the new edition. It's a story by Martin J. Havron, and it was first transcribed and used on radio on May 2nd, 1953. On Monday morning, March 13th, 1893, Colonel Arthur Rankin died at Hotel Dieu Hospital in Windsor. He was 77, and his body was interred at the Catholic Cemetery in Sandwich. To many, he was a paradox. He could be firm, determined, and shrewd, but also irascible, fiery, bombastic, and uncompromising. Of Irish parentage, he was born in Montreal in 1816. At 15, he left school to become a cabin boy on a packet ship that ran from New York to Liverpool. After several years, he tired of the sea and joined his brother Charles in Owen Sound, where he became a land surveyor. He also bought a farm to supplement his income. It didn't last. By the time he was 20, he enlisted in the infantry, stationed at Sandwich, where he nearly killed a Detroit lawyer, Henry Richardson, in a duel on Belle Isle. And since that time, he faced several opponents in the field of honor. During the Patriot Rebellion of 1837 to 38, Rankin served under Colonel John Prince, was promoted to lieutenant, and saw action at the Battle of Windsor, where he captured the enemy flag. For his bravery, he received a commendation from the English House of Lords. In 1840, he married the eldest daughter of Alexander McKee of Sandwich and had 2 sons. By 1843, he developed a pioneer Wild West show with a band of local Ojibwe. He went on tour to England, where he performed twice for Queen Victoria, earning the equivalent of $16,000 in the process. After returning from England, he partnered with John Waddell, the sheriff of Essex and Kent counties. They planned to run a steamship line from Chatham to Montreal. Several vessels were built, including the George Moffat, but the venture proved a failure when one ship was wrecked and the other disabled. Undaunted, Rankin turned to mining. Remembering his training as a surveyor, he became a guide at the copper deposits of Lake Superior. With his brother-in-law, Alexander McKee, he organized a small party of voyageurs for a rapid exploration of the North Shore by birch bark canoe. He found several promising deposits, two of which netted about $70,000. The money allowed him to speculate in Windsor real estate in anticipation of the Great Western Railway coming to town. In 1851, Rankin entered politics as the Conservative candidate for Kent County, but was defeated. 3 years later, he ran for a seat in the legislature in Essex County against Albert, the son of Colonel John Prince, and was elected. In a subsequent campaign, he was driving up Sandwich Street where he was pelted with rotten eggs by an angry mob. He ordered his driver to stop, took 2 revolvers out of his pockets, and defied the mob to throw another egg. The men dispersed. Rankin was never successful as a politician. He was too impulsive, hot-tempered, and insubordinate. At one point, he even challenged John A. Macdonald, the Conservative leader and eventual Prime Minister, to a duel. His British citizenship was placed in jeopardy when he tried to recruit a Lancer regiment in Michigan during the American Civil War, in contravention of Britain's declaration of neutrality. Faced with losing his citizenship, Rankin withdrew from the scheme, and it fell apart. And I thought, I'd never heard that story actually, and I thought, wow, that's a pretty incredible sort of a situation. And I look at the political situation of today and wonder if we need new guys like Rankin on the hustings. He was quite a colorful character.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.